Good evening, everyone, and happy International Women's Day. Welcome to Sex, Lies, and Hormones, the truth about women's health. My name's Magda Baima, and I'm the Director of Science Up First, which is an initiative of the Canadian Association of Science Centres. We are thrilled that tonight we will bring you some of the leading voices in women's health. Together, we'll dive into the latest research and dispel common myths related to so many of the health concerns that we have as women. But before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge and honor the land that we're on. We are gathered here today in what we call the city of Vancouver, which is situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This evening is a hybrid event, so although many of us are gathered here in person, we know that thousands will be joining us online as well. Wherever you are, I invite you to take a moment to acknowledge the original homelands of distinct living Indigenous cultures. If you'd like to learn more about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and steps that you can take as a settler on this land, visit nativeland.ca to get to know the cultures of Indigenous peoples, past, present, in your community. Okay, so before we get going, let's take care of a few housekeeping issues. For our audience in-house, please ensure that your mobile phones are turned off or put on silent. You will all have an opportunity, or many of you, to ask our expert panelists some questions at the end of our evening today. So please hang on to those questions and save them until then. And please note that our panelists are not able to give any personal medical advice at this time. For our online audience, you have the option to turn on closed captions with the button that's at the bottom of your screen. French audio for today's discussion is also available using the interpretation button. For the online audience, if you have questions, please submit them using the Q&A function at any point in time. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions possible during our live discussion. So, now without further ado, I would like to invite the CEO of the Saskatchewan Science Centre and Board President of the Canadian Association of Science Centres, Sandy Baumgartner, to kick off our event.
Thank you, Magda. And welcome, everyone. And happy International Women's Day. What a great crowd. And thank you for allowing me to take a few minutes to just introduce myself and the Canadian Association of Science Centres. As Magda mentioned, I am the CEO of the Saskatchewan Science Centre, located on Treaty 4 lands in Saskatchewan. And I have the great honor of being the president of the Canadian Association of Science Centres. And we're all in a science center today, so you'll have a bit of an idea of what a science center is, but many of you probably have very little knowledge, and this is not a criticism, but I'm here to help bring you to understand a little bit about the association. The Canadian Association of Science Centres is more than science centers. We're science communicators. We're organizations that are zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, outreach organizations that do science communication in the community. So if you're engaged in science outside of a school in a learning environment, you're likely engaging with a member of the Canadian Association of Science Centres. So we're more than just this lovely building that we're in today. We actually go out into our communities and do work in the communities. And I want to just take this moment to acknowledge that we are at Science World, one of the iconic science centers in our country, and I wanted to thank them for hosting us today. It's a beautiful facility. I want to kind of sneak off and go and play. There's some nice exhibits out there, but I'll stay and behave myself for a while. The association's mission is to encourage a thriving science and innovation culture in Canada. Now I have to get to my notes and wear my glasses, but and we do that through supporting our network of science centers, museums, zoos, the outreach network that we have, but we also do initiatives like Science Up First. You met Magda, who's the director of Science Up First. Science Up First came about in 2020. So flashback 3 years ago, you remember where we all were when the world shut down. A huge need in our communities came about in terms of dealing with misinformation. And the Canadian Association of Science Centres, along with the University of Alberta, created Science Up First to start dealing with the misinformation that was rampant in our communities around virus, around COVID, about vaccines. We all lived it, we know it. And now here we are 3 years later, dealing with misinformation in many more areas of our world. We're going to hear a lot about health issues for women's health tonight, but there's other issues in our communities, climate change, environmental issues, and there's a tremendous role for Science Up First and us in society to deal with the misinformation in our communities and make sure that we're dispelling those myths. We had no idea when we started the Science Up First initiative that we would be here 3 years later. It was one of those initiatives that you thought maybe you're going to work yourself out of a problem. Unfortunately, there's a lot more work to be done, and we're going to learn a lot about that tonight. So before we start, I do want to thank Magda and the team, the tech team here. They're rapidly keeping up with the questions on social media, dealing with some of the facts that you saw on the screen here, keeping that information alive, and building the content that we are all using in our communities to dispel myths. So thank you all for the work that you do and the leadership that you've brought. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, not just the energetic audience that we have here on site, but the thousands of you that are online virtually. If we could send you a little bit of that energy, maybe I'm doing that right now, because it is a great audience that we have, and we've got this lovely panel here. I'm blown away just by the magnitude of the experts that we're going to hear from. So I'm going to stop with talking about the energy. I'm going to bring the energy to the stage and introduce our keynote speaker. I'm honored to be able to introduce Dr. Jen Gunter. You all know who she is, but I think we need to just remind ourselves she's internationally renowned, New York Times bestseller, author of the Vagina Bible and the Menopause Manifesto. Dr. Gunter has been called the world's most famous and outspoken gynecologist and the internet's OBGYN, and one of the fiercest advocates for women's health. So I'm honored to welcome you to the stage and welcome you to this Science Up First event. Dr. Gunter, please come to the...
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. Always when I hear the introduction, I'm always thinking in my head, I'm just a girl from Winnipeg. So anyway, I'm really thrilled to be able to give you this talk tonight. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how lies about hormones online speak to all of us, where they kind of come from, and then what we can do about it. I want to start with just a little anecdote about something that is a little bit unrelated, but it gives you an idea about the problem of misinformation. So who here in the audience has seen the movie Catch Me If You Can? The one with Leonardo DiCaprio, right? He's the scam artist who's worked as a doctor, he's worked as a lawyer, he's worked as, he forged $2.5 million worth of checks from Pan Am, he flew. That's all a lie. He didn't do any of that. He was just a low-level crook who apparently sold a book all full of lies about being a crook that got made into a movie. The whole thing about him teaching the FBI about forgeries, also all made up. And why do we all believe that? Well, who would think Tom Hanks would lie to you? Who thinks Steven Spielberg would lie to you? And the thing is, you know what they didn't do, which is what we're going to learn to do tonight? They didn't fact check, right? They just accepted it because it was a good story and it spoke to them, and there was probably profit involved. So I think there's a lot to be said with that story. So this is the only meme I've ever made, and I'm going to stop here because it really just encapsulates everything. I feel like we have sailed through the age of information and we are stalled squarely in the age of disinformation. And, you know, when you are hampered by the truth, it's sometimes hard to make your content as interesting, right? When you can say whatever you want to say, when you can whatever wild story you want to make up, you know what? We all want to look. It's human nature, right? And so I think it's a really important thing as we're thinking about misinformation. You know, it plays into some truths about how we communicate, right? And the people who do it are sometimes aware of it, and sometimes they're just very skilled at it. So we're going to talk about this primarily because women's health has been underrepresented in healthcare. So, for example, in the United States, I think it was in 1993 when women actually first had to be included in medical studies, right? 1993, not like 63, not 23, right? We're talking in the 90s. And so it's true, we have these massive gaps in healthcare. I basically like to say healthcare is healthcare for men, right? And we're sort of retrofitting it for women, and sometimes poorly and sometimes well. And we are getting good research and we're learning more, but there are still stories every day of women sent home from the emergency department with chest pain, told that they're anxious when they're having a heart attack, people having strokes, people with terrible pelvic pain, not getting a diagnosis of endometriosis for 12 years, and on and on and on. So we have these gaps. We also have educational gaps, right? People graduate school and they might not even really know what menopause is. They might go through their whole life not knowing what it is because no one's ever taught them and no one's ever talked with them about it. So all of these gaps, from lack of education, from this patriarchal system, from all the reasons that happens, what that does is it creates space for predators, right? So a lot of the things we're going to be talking about are people who are taking advantage of those gaps. And in many times they're doing a very good smoke and mirror show to make you think that they're closing the gaps, but actually they're not. So I went through my Instagram this week to see, because, you know, it could change every week, but these are some of the things that people sent to me in direct messages. You know, do I need to balance my hormones? Birth control, will it change who I'm attracted to? I mean, no, it won't. Tampons are toxic and they cause endometriosis. No, they don't. And also, you don't need to balance your hormones. That's gibberish. Can boric acid balance my pH? Nope. Period underwear is dangerous? No, it's not. Help, I have too much dirty estrogen? No, you don't. And also, hormones can't be dirty. The COVID-19 vaccine causes miscarriages. Should I take compound hormones? No, you don't. It doesn't cause miscarriages. And birth control is a group 1 carcinogen, and that's actually a lot of misinformation tied up into that. But you see those things and they sound really scary, and it's easy for me to rattle all that off, to know that right away I shouldn't even click on any link associated with that because this is my job. But when we're going out online, we don't expect people to be disinfluencers, right? We don't expect them to be sharing things that are harmful. And sometimes they don't know, but sometimes they do. And so let's talk a little bit about why some of these myths are particularly sticky, because in their core, they represent a quest for purity, right? Historically, a good vagina is a tight and dry vagina, because God forbid if you get wet during sex, it means that you've had sex with many people before. I'm like, what does that even say about your partner? But that's like a whole different discussion, right? Like, really? You're proud? I mean, whatever. But, you know, but that's a good vagina, right? The very essence, having menstruation, meant that your body was filthy and polluted. And we have to remember that historically, medicine and religion were basically the same thing. They really didn't diverge until, you know, kind of the 1800s. And so this back to nature, being pure, being natural, these are all also sort of Christian or religious types of beliefs in many type of religions, right? And these have become tied up with sort of alternative healthcare, and all of this kind of messaging is about a return to purity, which of course for, you know, women is a return to virginity, to being untouched, to being ready to be a breeder. They all tie into that same myth in some way. And so a quest for purity is a quest for profit. And my personal theory is, because this has been part of our way we have lived for centuries, right? My mother, her mother, her mother, her mother, and her mother, for so on, were sort of steeped in this idea of purity being good and natural. That's why it all seems so familiar to us, because we see it everywhere. And I got to tell you, once you start seeing it everywhere, you can't stop. It's just, you know, purity myth, purity myth. I feel like one of those, you know, MTV pop-up shows, you know, where the balloon pops up all the time. So whenever you see these things marketed, I want you to think about these words like pure, natural, clean, fresh, wholesome. They are used to sell hormonal products or things to regulate the reproductive tract or to scare you away from birth control. And these are the words of the patriarchy. That is what they are. They're effective marketing tools, but you need to know that. So the other problem that we face, besides this sort of purity culture that's everywhere and a very effective sales tactic, is fears about reproductive health make copy. There is no better way to get on above the fold on the New York Times than to have something scary, because we got to scare women away from stuff to help them. God forbid they actually get better. So in 2002, the Women's Health Initiative was halted. This was a big study on menopausal hormone therapy. And of course, there was some data that showed that it was associated with an increased risk of blood clots, heart disease, and breast cancer. And that's a whole separate discussion about how to interpret that. But that being said, it made above the fold in the New York Times. And of course, people on hormone therapy dropped from 42% to less than 5%. When osteonecrosis with bisphosphonates, a great therapy for osteoporosis. When we learned that, I mean, the risk is 1 in 100,000. The very rare event, use of these medications plummeted. So what are we supposed to do to protect our bones? We're not supposed to do anything. If you have osteoporosis, it's too bad. You can't take something because of risk of 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 10,000. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? So all the papers that showed that these things are actually safer to be on, did those appear above the fold? No, not at all. They're kind of, in the hinterland, page 10 maybe if you're lucky. But the point that I want to really bring home here is how many of you know that use of phosphodiesterase inhibitors, drugs like Viagra, can cause blindness? You ever see that above the fold in the New York Times? Nope. Risk is about 3 in 100,000. Wow. Preventing osteoporosis seems like it's much more important than helping erections to me in the grand scheme of things, because keeping people alive is probably more important. But why is that? And it's because scaring men about things that are good for them doesn't make copy. Why? Purity culture. Now look at these. These are all headlines just taken from recently, right? January, these are November. This is all about period underwear being toxic. Do you remember that? It was in the news. I mean, it's all misinformation. It's all things that have been blown up. And I'm like, okay, but what about like men's underwear? Like their junk actually touches it. Like, don't you worry about their underwear now? Like, why are we worried about this? Because it gets copied. There's no data to show that there's any reason to be scared or concerned about this in any way. But still, story after story after story. None of these pieces were accurate, and it made me think, okay, we know all the tampon myths. Oh, there was titanium dioxide with tampons, which was another ridiculous thing that happened a few months before this. And everything is scary and everything is dangerous, and it made me feel like, so nobody's going to be happy until we're just all bleeding on our clothes? Again, purity culture, because if you're bleeding on your clothes, you can't leave the house. Right? You're stuck in the house. You can't be out working. You can't be out doing things. And so, again, purity culture ties into this. And another problem we have is the rise of celebrity wellness culture. So there's all kinds of issues. So yeah, the jade egg, right? Everybody's like, someone in the back of the audience would be like, do jade egg, because that's the one, with Gwyneth Paltrow, and, because I dared to, use my appropriate confidence to talk about that. But so they're selling you grifts, they're selling you things, they're selling you supplements, they're selling you, one of the Kardashians is selling a vagina wellness gummy, because vagina should smell like pineapple and not vaginas. I'm like, okay. That's all a myth too, the whole pineapple thing. That's, again, patriarchy, right? If your vagina doesn't taste right, something wrong with it. Obviously, patriarchy, it's everywhere. You see it everywhere. So one of the big problems, though, with celebrity wellness culture isn't sort of the fact that, because I believe most people aren't going to buy the Implantorama coffee home enema system. I think most people are not going to buy that. And some people might buy the jade eggs and not use it. But some people might be buying this boric acid and using it inappropriately, right? But the big problem with these celebrity sites is they introduce you to conspiracy theories, and they introduce you to toxic beliefs that are harmful. And at the first time you're exposed to these things, you are the most vulnerable and the most likely to believe them. So they provide a large platform for people who are anti-vaccine, who are promoting supplements, people who are going to lead you away from things that can help you. And of course, the celebrities always backtrack by saying, oh, I'm just asking questions, right? Oh, I'm just asking questions. Well, in science, we call that hypothesis, and your hypotheses aren't actually very good. So you're not really asking a question, you're just being a disruptor. But the other thing when I was making this talk and I was looking at all the products, because they sell a lot of vaginal stuff on these celebrity wellness sites, right? Because vaginal mayhem sells, right? Because again, why? Purity culture. And all these products, you know what? They just don't seem too different than, these ads for the Lysol douches, right? Like it's very similar. They're all just like one step away from that. And again, once you start seeing it, it's really hard to unsee it. And we know that celebrities have a big influence. And we like to think, oh, it's funny, I can laugh at Goop, or I can, roll my eyes at Kourtney Kardashian, or whatever they're promoting. But the truth of the matter is, when we studied this during COVID, we found that celebrities were one of the biggest drivers of misinformation online. They may have only disseminated about 20% of the misinformation, but because of their reach, because we love celebrities, because we like to share what celebrities say, because Newsweek wants to ask Kourtney Kardashian's opinion as opposed to, the infectious disease doctor who's actually the COVID-19 expert, because of all these things, their content spreads disproportionately. And so the celebrity misinformation was 69% of all social media engagements. So they create this disproportionate hazard. And this is something that really shows that in action. So this is a graph that shows some key points along the way in menopause research. So in 2000 was the very first published report of gabapentin for hot flashes. So it's a non-hormonal medication that we can use for hot flashes. It's not as good as estrogen, but it can actually help a lot of people. Now, that was the very first time that was published. So meaning up until that point, we really didn't have many non-hormonal options, right? In 2002 is when the Women's Health Initiative came out and hormone prescriptions dropped. So what did that leave us with? It left us with a massive gap. We didn't have other things. We had to scramble to reinterpret the Women's Health Initiative. And what happened in 2009 during this big gap? Well, Suzanne Somers and Dr. Christiane Northrup appeared on Oprah to promote bioidentical hormones. And below, you see that there's a graph with 3 spikes, and they're lined up. That third spike is the day after that episode. And those spikes all coincide with the release dates of Suzanne Somers' book on hormones, and they're search terms for bioidentical hormones. So the peak search term comes each day after she publishes basically the same book every 2 or 3 years. One's called like The Sexy Years, one's called like Sexy Hormones. It's like the same book rewritten 3 times. But each time it came out, it caused Google Trends to produce that massive spike. And obviously the combination of being on Oprah is, huge. But it shows how much celebrities drive the information that we see and consume. And it doesn't matter if every single person here's like, well, I don't care. I'm going to put, Kardashian on all my blocked words, and I'm not going to see, but the problem is they drive what Newsweek says. They drive what gets in the New York Times. I mean, I get so exasperated sometimes when journalists contact me to like, what do you have to say about, Kourtney Kardashian? I'm like, nothing. She's not like, you're actually saying that like we're on the same level? Like I should about vaginal health, like what? That's what the implication is. But the fact of the matter is they drive the culture. And then we have celebrity doctors. Dr. Christiane Northrup, who is the pandemic's worst woman, she's one of the dirty dozens for spreading misinformation. I know a lot of people say, oh, but wasn't she really great? No, she actually was never great. I've read her original book. She's all full of victim blaming. She talked about consulting, somebody about auras to decide if she should operate on somebody with fibroids. I mean, I don't know. I like my things more like in the physical plane. And then we have, new doctors capitalizing on vaccine misinformation because it's profitable. And this guy's bragging about being on Tucker Carlson. I'm like, I would be so embarrassed if Tucker Carlson wanted me to be on his show. I can't even believe, how are you not embarrassed? Because it makes money, right? And then we have femtech, and everybody's like, oh, femtech's awesome. But you have to remember that a lot of femtech, or most of what I've seen, is driven by, private venture capitalists, right? And it's driven by a board of directors. It's driven by people who want to make money. This isn't, a lab at the University of British Columbia that's used grants, that's come up with this product from all of this type of research, and then they're going to make it available at cost for the public because they used public dollars to get it. These are people who are hoping to capitalize on the gaps, right? Because venture capitalists want 4 times or maybe even a 10 times return on the money they put in. And medicine doesn't generate that kind of profit. If it did, we wouldn't need venture capitalists, right? So we've seen this explosion of home hormone tests and virtual care. And many of these virtual care clinics for menopause are upselling supplements, and they're upselling compounded hormones, and they're upselling vaginal laser therapy, which is shown to be ineffective, right? So you have to be very careful. What's the upsell that comes along with these things? And finally, I want to show this slide from JAMA. And this was actually a really great letter that was published in JAMA back in 2013, but it's still relevant. And what they did was the guy asked people what conspiracy theories they believed in. And a stunning number of people, right? Like 63% of people had heard that the Food and Drug Administration was deliberately hiding natural cures from people. 37% of people agreed with that. They actually agreed that that was happening. 37%, that's 1 in 3 people. Or that, we want to vaccinate children even though we know vaccines cause autism. 20% of people believe that. 20%, right? So the people who are here, to all of us, because we're engaged in science, these numbers seem hard to believe, but when we think about what happened during COVID, right, these numbers actually start to make sense. So why do conspiracy theories live so much in wellness? Why do they want you to believe in conspiracy theories? Because they do, right? Fluoride's going to kill you, vaccines are damaging. Well, some of it is this sort of race to the natural, because that's effective marketing. But the more conspiracy theories you believe in, the more likely you are to take supplements. And supplements are what funds wellness. That's how you make money. The more conspiracy theories. So if you believe in 3 conspiracy theories, 35% of you will be taking herbal supplements. Supplements are the wheel that drives alternative medicine. And if we made them have the same requirements as prescription pharmaceuticals, we would cut off this pipeline. To me, this would be the biggest way to cut off all these grifters and medical conspiracy theorists, because we're like, okay, great, your product works, prove it, or we can't sell it because we care. So that's why supplements are such a big part of alternative medicine. That is where the money comes from. So I want to talk a little bit about one of these myths particularly, and this is kind of what I like to sort of say the truthiness of it all. So Stephen Colbert, when he had his very first night of the Colbert Show, he wasn't going to tell the news to you, he was going to feel it to you. Right? And that's what we see with a lot of these influencers, because you trust them, you're feeling it with them. So let's look at this myth. And what they do is they take a little kernel of truth and it gets twisted, and that's why it sounds familiar, because there is maybe a kernel of truth in there. So birth control pills, class 1 carcinogen, this is what they promote. Well, first of all, this is a conspiracy theory, right? So the idea that a common prescription is actually cancer-causing in a way that would be harmful to people, if that was happening and this was a very common prescription but no one was talking about it, that's a conspiracy theory. It really is. There's also a devil term. So in rhetoric, we have God terms and devil terms. And God terms are pure, clean, natural, all the things that fit in with purity culture, right? When we hear those words, we automatically fill in the blanks that they're positive. But when you hear a devil word, you automatically fill in the term and you think it's a negative. Well, in medicine, we're stuck with like cancer, disease, coughing, sputum, discharge. We're stuck with those kinds of words. So they're using carcinogen. They're using a devil term to scare you. There's a kernel of truth. Sure, estrogen is carcinogenic. That's how people get breast cancer from their own ovaries, and that's how they get endometrial cancer from their own body. But that doesn't mean that a drug specifically causes cancer. This appeal to purity, because the implication here is that birth control pill is polluting your body. And finally, it's serving the patriarchy in another way, because if they cared about estrogen being carcinogen, they would also talk about the increased risk of breast cancer that persists for several years after being pregnant, which is related to the estrogen exposure. So it can't really be about the estrogen, and it can't really be about the cancer, can it? It's actually about scaring people about birth control. So how do we undo all this? And it's hard, right? I mean, it's hard. That's why we have, we need these types of initiatives like Science Up First. So I want to give an example. So I had a podcast for TED, free to listen to. The first episode we did on water, and I wanted to take on the myth, 8 glasses of water a day, because it's a total myth. That's why you have a thirst mechanism, really. It really is. Drink when you're thirsty, and it's fine. It can be Diet Coke. That's my favorite, personally. So we had the podcast. We had a little video. It did really well. It was really great. And so one day I went to the comments section, and I shouldn't have. But I was so happy to see all the comments feeling the same way I did about this. I 100% feel mentally and physically better when I drink a lot of water throughout the day. My skin does look better, and my gut health functions better. I sleep better. Everything's better. I'm sure she is way more accredited than I am to speak on this, but I strongly disagree. Okay. My body tells me when I need water when it's too late. It actually doesn't. I always have a water bottle near me in my peripheral vision. If I fail to drink 8 glasses of water a day, I feel like a zombie. This applied to my parents and friends too. So I suggest you guys take this video with a grain of salt. Okay, well, that's actually like a joke there, but whatever. And yeah, I don't think she's a very reliable source. Like, sure, you don't need 8 glasses, but that doesn't mean it isn't better. I think she's missing the point, right? I had a world-renowned nephrologist who wrote a book on how the kidney works to explain it all. Did you know your thirst mechanism is so evolved that when you start drinking, your brain can calculate with all the receptors in your mouth how much fluid you need. And that's why your thirst mechanism shuts off before that water has even gone through your gut into your bloodstream. Your body is monitoring you. If it didn't, we would have died, right? Thirst is actually a very important thing. So I just find it interesting that with this attention to detail, providing it in so many different ways, it's so hard to break through. Or this one, the comment section, very bad place. The reason why you don't want to go to a comment section is just one ad hominem attack, if you read it, can make you disbelieve the content that you read. Just one, right? So especially with Instagram, where you see all these comments, or TikTok, that's why it's so hard to be an effective communicator when the comments are enabled. But if you don't enable the comments, then you're hiding something, obviously. And this person actually thought that my hair turned white from the vaccine. I'm like, hey, you've never heard of hair dye? I mean, okay. But, so all kinds of sort of attacks related to that. And then there's something called the illusory truth effect. We all mistake repetition for accuracy. And one theory is sort of repeated statements are easier for us to process. And sort of it's called processing fluency, and it's used as a cue for truth. Well, think about social media. You see the same thing over and over and over again. The Newsweek picks it up and Time picks it up, and then those stories circulate through. And now you haven't just seen one blogger write about how period underwear is dangerous. You've seen it from 15 different sources, right? And especially think about TikTok with stitches, right? That the content just gets generated over and over and over again. And the greater impact is in a shorter time frame, and that's exactly what happens with TikTok, right? When something goes viral, you see that same video. Like, I learned more about mascara than I ever needed to know a few weeks ago, and if you know, you know. And I'm talking about like the mascara for eyelashes, because I learned that that's also code for something which I didn't know. So, and the effect is greater with ambiguous statements, but it even works for implausible statements. I'm going to talk about that in just a sec. And knowledge doesn't necessarily protect you. And what's really interesting is the illusory truth effect works whether you're 5 years old, 10 years old, or you're an adult. So it's something definitely about the way humans process information. So when it comes to false statements that you're exposed to, it just takes 5 repetitions to start to think that something might be accurate. Now, the first exposure can have an effect, but they did a study with these implausible statements. Apple owns 75% of USA office buildings. The population of North Dakota is greater than a population of New York State. The tallest person is 35 feet tall. George Washington was born in China. Benjamin Franklin lived to be 150 years old, and the earth is a perfect square. And after repeating this to people over and over and over again, people started to move on this sort of score that they had for believability, right? So if it can happen with these statements, then what happens when you see things like birth control pills are carcinogens, or you need to balance your hormones, or you need to use boric acid to regulate your vaginal pH, right? These things they're far less crazy than these statements, right? And you see them over and over and over again. So, well, you could just do your own research. And I know that's kind of like a really loaded statement because we want to teach people how to do their research correctly, because the way they're doing it now is not working. In fact, internet users are more likely they're more likely to have negative beliefs about vaccines. And the reason for that is because when you do a search, if you just do a Google search, what comes up is what's popular. This isn't like going to the library and having a librarian do a great curated search for you and throwing out all the stuff that's trash and then giving you the 4 things that you should be looking at, or learning how to do that yourself, right? This is what's popular. And there's a really sad example. There's an awful predatory procedure called the O shot. It cannot help you in any way, and it's one of my red flags. If you happen to be at a gynecologist or a urologist and they offer that, you should get up and walk out the door, because if they believe that's helpful, I'd be scared to know what else they think is helpful. It's very predatory. But if you go online as a person trying to advocate for yourself to look online because you're thinking about it, because your doctor told you about it, you have to work to find something negative because of the search engine optimization. The first several pages on the internet, I mean, who goes to page, the bottom of the page, never mind page 2 or page 5, the first several pages are all glowing things about the procedure. So how can the average person read through that if they didn't know about search engine optimization? Because every single person who offers that procedure becomes a legitimate site for Google to trawl through to put that into the mentions, right? Or put that into the search. So what happens is people often then end up falling victim to alternative medicine and people who don't wish them well because of the way the internet works. And so we want people to look things up, but we need them to learn how to do it so they can do it safely. Just in the same way you wouldn't get in a car if you didn't know how to drive it. You had to learn how to drive a car, and it's the same kind of thing. Now apply everything that I've said to social media. Influencers who you trust, just like we trusted Tom Hanks. Tom, I can't believe it. I was so disappointed when I found out Catch Me If You Can was fake, was all made up. My gosh. Sharing content built on purity culture, multiple posts on a subject, the comment section, media repeating the lie. You look it up and then you're tripped by search engine optimization, right? The odds are stacked against you. And this is just from my Facebook. I made some silly vaccine. Well, not silly. It was a good video, but I don't know. It pulled in all kinds of anti-vaxxers, and look what happened to my engagement. I got a little thing from Facebook telling me that I was doing really well, and I should post more videos like that. So this is the problem. If you're an influencer and you're making money from page clicks, for me, I was like, okay, I'm not posting on Facebook for a while because I don't want to deal with that. But it just goes to show that when you're monetized by page clicks, even if you don't necessarily believe those conspiracy theories yourself, maybe you're a fashion blogger, maybe you're a fashion, Instagram or whatever you like to call them, but the more clicks you have and the more engagement, then you get a better deal from the makeup company. You get a better deal from the other company, right? So clicks are money as well, even if it's not about that particular content. So what protects you against the illusionary truth effect? How can you go out there and get information? And I don't want people to think that it's not possible, because it absolutely is. What you have to do is you have to fact check the very first time. You can't let it go. You have to stop and fact check. Because it can just take one exposure to change a belief. And that means that all arguments don't have 2 sides. So that's an important thing for the media to think about. So I am happy to introduce you to Dr. Gunter's 4-step program. Which is not my trademark, but I thought that was funny. And those are my 2 kids from a long time ago when they were like 2 and they were so cute, and now they're 19-year-olds and they're so different. So I had to look at the pictures when they were young and cute. So we're going to talk about pre-bunking, pausing, debunking, and blocking. It's an effective strategy. So pre-bunking means inoculating yourself against misinformation. It means the very first time you see something, pausing and reflecting and deciding, should I fact check this? Should I not? Scroll further, read further on this person's content. I'm going to step away and look. I can't tell you everything about hormonal health, but I can tell you about the common tropes and techniques like I just did. So you see purity culture, right? You see that type of content. You see conspiracy theories. Those are all red flags. You've got to walk away from that content. You're not looking, you can't learn anything from that content. You've got to not engage. Pausing to fact check. So you've got to stop, you've got to fact check. you can take the question and you can Google it in a way, and this is my quick and dirty way for Googling things. So it's hard to decide if you don't have a degree in something, how to look it up. I mean, I'm an expert in a lot of these things, and sometimes when I'm writing a post on it, it can take me 2 days to weed through all the literature that I know really well to make sure that I'm being incredibly accurate about something. So you can put your question in and then put SOGC, Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in Canada, or NAMS, North American Menopause Society, or Signs Up First. Put that into the search bar too, and what that will do is force that content to come to the top. And this is just a search that I did with, I just put hormones, hot flashes, North American Menopause Society. Very first thing that came up was related to one of their releases, right? So it's a very, very easy way to get quick answers that are more likely to be factual. You can also put in your question and put fact check. It works better with COVID and vaccines than it does for other things, but there's a lot of news organizations who've spent time fact checking things, and if you put the word fact check in, it can make a difference. Not only pausing to fact check, and I know it's not easy, but also pausing before you share, right? Because you want to limit the contagion. So you want to know, is this person an expert? Do they have a board certification? Do they have clinical expertise? Now, that's not always the case. Christiane Northrup, pandemic's worst woman, is board certified in OBGYN. Have they disclosed their conflicts of interest? How do they profit from this information? And I think that's a really important question whenever you see an influencer. And people who aren't experts in medicine, be very careful about anybody using the term functional in their handle. I know it sounds great, but it's nothing. It doesn't mean anything. A functional nutritionist, I could start Dr. Jen Gunter's program for functional gynecological nutrition. That sounds actually really good, doesn't it? I could have somebody do an online course, 10 questions. I could print out a diploma, and they could call themselves a certified functional gynecological nutritionist, which is absolutely worthless. So functional has absolutely no meaning when it comes to board certification, training. It's a kind of a made-up thing. Be very careful about naturopaths. There's a lot of hormone misinformation that comes from them as well. And who are they associated with? You know, if you want to look up an expert, you'd be surprised when you put their name in and put Goop afterwards to see what they've done with Goop, or what their association with Christiane Northrup. Do they sell supplements? Are they anti-vaccine? If they are, you don't want anything to do with them. They're not real experts. Debunk. So this is basically after the fact. You've absorbed the information, or someone else has absorbed it, and you're trying to correct them. It's the last line of defense, really, because it's very hard to undo, because you can undo it, but they still have the memory. They still have the memory of how that made them feel, especially when we're talking about things that deal with purity culture. And it doesn't reach everybody who needs it, right? Retraction or, explanation of the Women's Health Initiative, that didn't appear above the fold in the New York Times. So when you're trying to debunk, be careful about scientific jargon. It actually turns people off. It really undermines the message. Try to be nice, try to be authentic, and make the correct information the star, not the takedown. And debunking doesn't perpetuate the fallacy if it's done correctly. There's different strategies for different people. If somebody hasn't received a booster for COVID, or they're a fence sitter, well, they might be somebody who would be swayed actually by learning about complications of not getting the booster, right? The death rate versus being fully vaxxed with the full series versus partially vaxxed. But somebody who's scared of the vaccine, if you show them information about a picture of somebody on a ventilator, that might scare them even more. And what that does is it makes them stop and do nothing. And that's actually called omission bias. The idea that if I don't do anything and something bad happens, then I haven't caused it, right? And so if somebody's scared, making them more scared actually doesn't help. So that's an important point. And then finally, blocking. People don't block enough. I got this today. I looked today to see what message somebody about folate versus folic acid. Anybody who's telling you to take natural folate, block them, because it hasn't been studied for neural tube defects. You want to take folic acid. And so every single day someone sends me, what about this? My answer, just block them. Don't engage. Because if this is what they're sharing, everything else that they're sharing, or this one, the holistic mind blown by the fact women are still prescribed birth control when they're only fertile 1 to 3 days of the month. Well, there's a lot more complexity to that, Karen. And if that way you pronounce that were simply true, we really wouldn't have the unplanned pregnancy rate that we have, would we? And there's all kinds of things that play into getting pregnant. So, block them. Just block them. They don't care. You're not going to hurt their feelings. They're just going to go and spread their misinformation to somebody else. But really, the other thing that you do when you block someone is you're training your feed to not send you that content, right? You want to use that AI learning model for you. So I'm going to end with, think about who's filling the gaps and who's exploiting them. Is there this appeal to nature and purity? Purity culture is everywhere in wellness. Are there conspiracy theories? Is there financial motive? Is it too good to be true? What is their expertise? You want to pre-bunk, you want to pause, you want to debunk, and you want to block robustly. And I'm hoping that some of the content that I have on what I like to call the Dr. Gunter Media Empire, which is really just me, might actually be helpful, and watch this space for my book that's coming soon. And I'm really excited to get into it with our other panelists here. So thank you so much for your attention.
Wow, wasn't that fantastic? I think that deserves a second round of applause. Well, thank you, Dr. Gunter, for sharing your insightful and thought-provoking ideas with us. Your presentation has definitely set the tone for the rest of the night, and we're definitely excited to continue this conversation with our esteemed panelists that are coming up very soon. Before that, I'd like to give an introduction to who I am. So my name is Dr. Esther Odukunle, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for this evening. I'm a research scientist at Accelera here in Vancouver, but if you notice from my accent, I'm from the UK in London. But perhaps I'm probably better known to many as the face behind Science Uncovered, which is an Instagram platform popular for engaging with the scientific community, communicating science, and trying to advocate for diverse representation and inclusivity in STEM. And I'm definitely honored to be part of tonight's event with you all. So now we'll get to introducing our extremely accomplished panelists. So we'll start with Dr. Laurie Brotto. I have a bit of an introduction for you, so feel free to stay seated for a bit. So Dr. Laurie Brotto is a professor in the UBC Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and she's also a registered psychologist in Vancouver, Canada. She has been the Executive Director of the Women's Health Research Institute of BC, located at BC Women's Hospital since 2016. Dr. Brotto holds a Canada Research Chair in Women's Sexual Health, and she is the author of Better Sex Through Mindfulness, How Women Can Cultivate Desire, and the Better Sex Through Mindfulness Workbook. Please come and join us on stage. And to complete this lovely panel, we have Dr. Melissa Lem, who is a Vancouver family physician who also works in rural and northern communities within Canada. Being the president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and the director of PARX, which is Canada's National Nature, this is a tongue twister, Canada's National Nature Prescription Program powered by the BC Parks Foundation. She is an internationally recognized leader in the field of nature and health. She has also engaged in advocacy and policy work on a broad range of other issues, from climate change and hydraulic fracturing to sustainable healthcare and low carbon transportation. Please come and join us on stage. So we have Dr. Gunter joining us as well, so no introduction is needed on that front. So over the last week, the Science Up First team has collected a number of questions in advance, so we'll use that to kick off the panel. We will then open up the second half of this conversation to our lovely audience in person and online, so please hold your questions until then. And I will just move to sit down because these shoes aren't as comfortable as I think.
They look great, though.
Thank you. Cool. So we'll get the panel started. So I will start with Dr. Gunter. So we hear a lot about estrogen and testosterone, but they aren't the only hormones in our body. So what exactly are hormones and their purpose?
Yeah, so hormones are just chemical messengers. They take a message from one part of the body, usually an organ, to another part. Sometimes it can be from one cell to the cell next to it, or it can be far away to different parts. So insulin is a hormone, thyroid hormone is a hormone, estrogen, testosterone, androstenedione. There's many different hormones in the body. And so they all play important roles, and sometimes we need higher levels, sometimes we need lower levels. And estrogen and progesterone, which are the two most commonly thought of hormones in reproductive health, are primarily designed to get the cycle ready each month for a potential pregnancy. And this is all because of gearing the body up for menstruation. Well, menstruation is a byproduct of not getting pregnant. And so there are far-reaching effects. We need much higher levels when we're of reproductive age, because those higher levels need to basically retrofit the system for pregnancy. They need to build a thick lining, and so they have to do all that. When we're no longer capable of getting pregnant during menopause, we need much lower levels. And actually, something a lot of people don't know is it's not just your ovaries that make estrogen. Your brain does, your bone does, your muscles. And so we actually have a lot of sources from other tissues.
Wonderful. So just following on from like the different levels in hormones, we often hear that our hormones are out of whack, or that we need to balance them in some way. Is balancing hormones even possible?
So no, so that is one of those terms that sounds right. It sounds like it should be right, but it's not at all. That's just not how the system works. And so estrogen levels are changing morning to afternoon to evening. Your progesterone levels are changing. They're changing daily. They're changing in response to everything. So I would like people to think more about their hormones like instruments in a concert. And everything has to play together. And sometimes the horn section is louder, sometimes the string section is louder, and everything is interrelated. And so it's more about harmony than about balance.
Thank you. So Dr. Lem, let's talk about products. So there's a huge market out there for products that make various claims regarding our hormones. So there's herbal supplements, supplements being the buzzword of tonight. Herbal supplements and teas claiming to balance hormones, homeopathic hormone remedies, detox products claiming to remove hormonal toxins, various creams and sprays. If a patient comes to you with questions about these types of products, what kind of advice would you offer them?
I think I'm fairly lucky in that these kinds of questions don't often come into my office because they're usually going to Dr. Google or going to a naturopath and asking them these kinds of questions. But I definitely welcome them because I want to know what my patients are thinking. But the first thing I do as a family doctor is think about what my job is. So my job is to take undifferentiated symptoms and try to come up with a differential, try to rule out serious things, and then keep in mind the most common conditions. And so that's what I'll do first, is I'll try to zero in on what symptom, what constellation of symptoms they're trying to take this tea or spray or whatever it is for, and then try to make sure that it's not due to something more serious. So you can be tired because you have iron deficiency, or you can be tired because you have a low hypothyroidism, or all kinds of different things. So trying to make sure that it's not their hormones that's causing this issue. And then what I'll do is, if I've got time, because sometimes these supplements have, 20 different things in them, is I'll go to some of my evidence-based databases and look at the top ingredients and make sure and see if there's any evidence for it. Often, a lot of these supplements have not been tested. The randomized controlled trials haven't been done, so there really is a bit of a black box. But I want to make sure that there's no harm to what they're taking. And then if they say, well, what do you think about this? I make sure it's not harmful. I say, you can try it if you want. If you have the money to pay for it and you want to try it, go ahead. And in the back of my mind, I think there's something called the placebo effect, which a lot of us know about. On average, for an average medication to treat symptoms, it's about 30% effective. In some medications, 60% effective. So I think if they want to take this, it's not harmful. It might make them feel better. So I say, go ahead. If it's not costing you an arm and a leg and there's no harm, take it. But if it's been months and months and you're being promised by some kind of practitioner who's profiting from selling you supplements that just wait, just take it a bit longer and you'll see benefit, then I say maybe it's time to step away from the lack of evidence and then maybe investigate other things. But that's what I do. And now I would point them to Dr. Jen Gunter's website or books to look to see what she says about these things, because I mean, it's a credible evidence-based source.
Thank you. So moving on to Dr. Brotto, there is a growing trend of using quote-unquote natural remedies or supplements to boost sexual desire. What is your perspective on these approaches, and what are some safe and effective options for improving sexual health?
Yeah, okay, good. We finally got to sex. It was the first word in tonight's title, and I kept waiting. Well, we're there. So it makes sense why there's such an allure over supplements and natural remedies. Why? Because at least a third of women across all ages will experience a significant sexual health issue, whether it's loss of interest in sex, pain with sex, which is extremely common, difficulties reaching orgasm or muted orgasm, blunted orgasm, orgasms that produce contractions but not any mental pleasure. And the reality is that the data indicate that we don't talk to our healthcare providers about those sexual difficulties. And it's sort of a two-way street. Women have great difficulty talking about their sexual health issues, and healthcare providers in turn also have a lot of embarrassment and difficulty talking about sexual health issues, mostly because even to this day, many medical schools don't do rigorous training in sexual health and how to assess it, how to treat it. So it makes sense why people are turning to Dr. Google, turning to supplements to improve their sexual health. I scoured the literature, and I do this on a regular basis, around, maybe there is some new product because we hear about it all the time. I went to my health food store and they promised there was a floor-to-ceiling banner on this particular tea leaf that will restore my libido to, age 20 levels. The problem is, there's multiple problems, and we've heard about it so far. There's a lack of science. And so the lack of information is almost as bad as disinformation, because there's just simply no data to evaluate these things. Sometimes when the scientific, or when the studies have been done, they've been done by the producers of those products who are full of conflicts of interest. So it's not arm's length science. Thirdly, as Dr. Lem pointed out, there's this incredible phenomenon that works so well, and it's called the placebo response. And in sexual health studies, it's about 50%. So if you enroll for a sexual health study to take a certain product that promises it's going to restore your libido, guess what? You have a 50% chance that it's going to work. Sign me up for that. There's no side effects. It's free. It's available anytime. So that is part of the problem, is that many of these supplements that have promise of improvement have not been studied, and the placebo response which works very, very well. And the more that you kind of pay for a particular product, this has been another area of science, the more that you pay for a product, the higher the placebo response is. So, the jade eggs that were $350, that placebo response is probably around 90%, because they're paying so much money, so you're expecting it to work. So, I'll just reaffirm what Dr. Gunter said earlier. Do your research, ask the questions, go to the credible sources, go to the scientific studies that have been peer-reviewed, which means evaluated by other scientists, and don't trust anything else.
I also just want to add, the placebo responses tends to be quite short-lived.
Yeah.
So people, for whatever reason you're taking it, and so then you go back and then you're recommended to take another supplement, right? And then after 3 months,
response goes up
another
again.
one. And so that's how the mill keeps going.
Thank you. So pivoting back to Dr. Lem, we know that environmental pollution can have real negative impacts on our health, but sometimes wellness influencers take this idea to an extreme, portraying everything as quote-unquote toxic. Can you speak to the balance between addressing real environmental risks and avoiding unnecessary fear and misinformation?
I thought it was really interesting, Dr. Gunter, what you said about this purity culture, because I think that's really what a lot of these natural pure cosmetics and products prey on. So there's this concept called the dose response curve. So essentially, There are certain things that are toxic, carcinogenic, if you take them in high enough amounts, but in very small amounts, it's very unlikely that our bodies can't deal with them. We have these mechanisms to detoxify. That said, there's an increasing awareness within science, within researchers, of something called cumulative or additive or synergistic effects of certain toxins. When they cause similar effects and you get a lot of a small amount of them together, they can then start causing these issues. So the science is starting to develop around this. So in terms of worrying about these kinds of toxins, you talked, Dr. Gunter, about water and drinking 8 glasses of water a day. Drinking too much of even wonderful, pure things like water can kill you, because you could dilute out your sodium and you could have a seizure and die. So, certain things that are good for you aren't necessarily good in large amounts. Certain things that are bad for you are okay for you in small amounts. But what I want to bring people's attention to is that we worry so much about cosmetics, about the things that we eat, but then the same people who are worrying about that are smoking, or they're drinking 2 glasses of wine per day, or they're breathing air pollution outside from fossil fuel burning vehicles, or breathing in nitric oxide from their gas stoves inside their homes. And so they're zeroing in on the wrong thing. We should look at the factors that actually cause harm, that are known and proven by science to cause harm. We should be cutting down the amount of alcohol we drink. We should be cooking on induction stoves or alternative methods of cooking. We should be limiting the amount of fossil fuels we burn outside to reduce air pollution. So you have to think about what the biggest bang for your buck is going to be when you start eliminating toxins from your life. Go for the big sources of toxins. Don't look at the minutia. And then one more thing I want to point out is that we have to think about how the beauty industry is also impacting people who are exposed to these chemicals every day. So there was a study that came out in the last year from the University of Toronto that looked at women who work in nail salons, and they tend to be lower income, racialized people. And in fact, there are lots of standards around regulating chemical exposures in other industries, like e-waste, for example. But in nail salons, it came out that these women were exposed to 30 times the amount of exposures to flame retardants and plasticizers, which are linked to cancer and other harms, at their work compared to people in their homes. And this is 10 times the amount of toxins that people who work in the e-waste industry, for example, are exposed to. So we have to think about the effects of our beauty routines on other populations, and think about the people who are actually exposed in large amounts to these toxins, but then think about eliminating the larger sources in our own lives. It's all a big circle. It's all connected.
Thank you. Dr. Gunter, let's talk about the wellness industry. So it is approximately a $1.5 trillion industry right now, mainly marketed to women, and a lot of it is bunk or pseudoscience. What are some red flags we should all be aware of to avoid grifters and ineffective or even dangerous products?
Yeah, so, I think we touched on some in the talk, so definitely, purity culture. If you see purity culture, you got to walk away. If it's linked with a conspiracy theory, if it's anti-vaccine, supplements are almost by and large untested, or they've been proven not to be effective. And I always tell people, instead of seeing the word supplement, you should change that in your mind to unproven, unstudied medication. Makes it sound a little different, right? Instead of having a God term, we switched it to a devil term. And to look at the marketing and to look at the celebrities and to think, so when you're thinking about a wellness product, what are you really hoping it's going to do for you? What's your bother factor that you want it to fix? Because a lot of times these things are almost like impulse purchases, in the sense that it's how it makes you feel, as opposed to what's it actually going to do to you? What's the concrete thing it can do for you? And if there's an actual bother factor, think about actually seeking medical care in a way that could actually help that.
Thank you. Pivoting back to Dr. Lem, giving you a little bit of a break while you're answering that. There is a lot of evidence that the medical concerns of female patients are not always taken seriously, and dismissing the importance of women's health concerns is definitely a big factor in the rise of the wellness industry. As a healthcare provider, how do you help advocate for your patients, and what advice would you give to patients for advocating for themselves?
And Dr. Gunter pointed this out during her talk, but about the massive inequities in research between men's and women's health. but also the massive inequities in how healthcare professionals treat women, unfortunately. So women are more likely to die from heart attacks because of delayed diagnosis, or they just don't believe the woman when she comes to the ER with chest pain. There was a study in Denmark that looked at how quickly women versus men are diagnosed with certain conditions. They're 72% more likely to have a delayed diagnosis compared to men. You mentioned pain as well. So women are much more likely to be dismissed their pain as being due to a mental health condition when they actually have, for example, endometriosis. So it's a travesty, actually, how we treat women in general in the medical profession. But in terms of helping women advocate for themselves, again, I think from my perspective as a family physician, I try to get at the root of what their symptoms are and help them understand what it is they're really looking for. So there's this concept in family medicine where we ask the patient about their feelings about the symptoms they're having, their ideas about what might be causing them, what kind of effect it's having on their function also, because sometimes people will think there's this, I have this issue, I have this idea that I have a problem, but if it's not actually causing that much of an impact on their function, like maybe you shouldn't worry about it that much, right? Don't listen to the people who are convincing you that this is actually a problem. And then I talk to them about their expectations, like what are you hoping to get out of this encounter? How can I help you reach your goals? And so with that in mind, I'm in fact happy when patients come and say, I've done my research, because almost every day I actually have a patient say to me, I'm so sorry, I looked on Google, I'm sorry, I know you don't like that. And actually I like that, and now that you've given us some great tips on how to properly search Google, I'll give them some tips also. But I in fact really like patients who do their research and come in with ideas, because there's nothing I like better than a patient who's well-read and has ideas about the kind of care that they want. But I also hope that same patient will be open to ideas from a trained professional, like a specialist or a family doctor. I like to work together with them as a team. So then, keeping in mind what they know, what they want, what their expectations are, I then try to help them come up with a plan. If it's beyond my expertise, I'll refer to a specialist colleague to help. But really, I think it's a process of helping them understand what the root of their issue is and working with them to meet their expectations and making sure that they're informed by evidence when we're working on that plan together.
Thank you. Now back to the sex. Dr. Brosho, when it comes to those conversations with our healthcare providers, there is a strong evidence that women are more willing to discuss their physical health with, let me go back. When it comes to those conversations with our healthcare providers, there is a strong evidence that women are more willing to discuss their physical health than their sexual wellness. What are some potential solutions and strategies to raise conversations about sexual wellness with our family doctor and partner or partners?
Well, I went to Science Up First, and the whole event was focused on debunking disinformation and having honest, real conversations that promote women's health. Can we have a conversation about my sexual health? Something as simple as that. So you can reference something else that you read or heard of, and it kind of depersonalizes it a little way. It's a way to sort of put the toe in the water and start to have the conversation. It's so fascinating. Low sexual desire is the most common of the sexual difficulties. Again, about a third of women across ages. There's a myth that it increases in frequency with age. It actually doesn't. It's dependent on so many other factors beyond age, and yet only a tiny fraction of women who have low desire have ever talked to their healthcare provider, their GP, about it. So we refer to other things. We also, it's really important that we recognize that sexual health is a part of quality of life, just like bone health and mental health and so many other aspects of health are a part of our health. And how do we know that? Well, the World Health Organization declared that about 20 years ago. But also when there are sexual difficulties, we start to see ripple effects on many other aspects of our health and function. So for example, one of the number one reasons for medication non-compliance, so not using your medications as they were prescribed to you, is because of sexual side effects. So you might go back to your family doctor and say, this medication never worked for me, but we're very reluctant to say it didn't work for me because it blunted my orgasms, right? So it's really important that when we think about sexual health and promoting sexual wellness, that we see it within this broader envelope of living well. There's also been fantastic data that show healthy sexual communication, which, by the way, is something you can learn later in life. You don't have to have learned healthy sexual communication as a teenager. You can learn about it in your 50s or your 70s or beyond. And it's a major predictor of happiness in couples in the long term. So being able to talk about sexual health, which includes what you like and what hurts. And the number of individuals who will say, I've never told a partner, yet we've been together for 30 years, that act that we do actually causes me a lot of pain. And they have a lot of shame and embarrassment, and they don't want to hurt a partner. And so when we take a step back and we see sexual health through the lens of overall living well into our older years, communicating well, then it becomes a no-brainer. Then we're able to overcome some of those barriers and stigma and shame around the secrecy of sexuality. So we're just going to treat it as a part of our health.
Lovely. And here's a follow-up question for you. So studies show that approximately half of all women experience some kind of sexual difficulty at one point in their lives. Can you talk about the impact of hormonal changes during different stages of life, such as menopause or postpartum, and how that impacts sexual interest? And what are some strategies to cultivate desire and pleasure?
Yeah, so as a registered psychologist, one of the things I pay a lot of attention to is sleep, mood, living well, relationships, communication. So absolutely hormonal changes, the fluctuations in estrogen that happen during the perimenopause, the dropping level of estrogen that happens during the postpartum with breastfeeding in particular, can lead to dryness in the vagina. And there's nothing like a dry vagina to reduce your interest in sex. And the laughs are probably nervous laughs. They're probably individuals who are saying, yeah, when sex hurts, your interest in it. It's like when you touch the oven and it's hot. Guess what? Your desire to touch the oven is going to go down. It's a perfect evolutionary mechanism in our brain to no longer desire the things that cause us pain. So absolutely, there may be hormonal changes that happen in the postpartum with breastfeeding during the perimenopause that can lead to pain. But let's not underestimate the role of fatigue and lack of sleep and night sweats that keep you awake at night, or a broader lack of interest, or depression. I mean, depression by definition is apathy. What's apathy? Lack of interest. There's not a special kind of segment that says, okay, when you're depressed, you're going to lose interest in everything except sex. No, you'll lose interest in sex as well. Now, there's a tiny segment of women that actually have the reverse, that have an increase in interest in sex with depression, but it's a really small segment of the population of depressed women. So when we think about the hormonal changes and all the other complex changes that happen with perimenopause, with pregnancy, postpartum, and breastfeeding, we need to take into account all these other factors that can have a direct effect. What's one of the number one panaceas for restoring sexual desire? Sleep, right? So before you reach for the supplement or ask for that prescription, ask yourself how many hours a night of sleep, and not just any sleep, but deep, stage 4 deep sleep, which is the restorative sleep that we need. That's the gas tank that's going to fuel you for your sexual desire and all the other things in your day.
Thank you. Dr. Gunter, the next question is for you. There are certain health touch points in many of our lives that greatly impact our hormones: puberty, pregnancy, postpartum. A lot of the health concerns surrounding these life stages are treated as taboo, but maybe none more than menopause. Why do you think menopause is treated this way?
Well, I think it's largely related to the impact of ageism on women and this idea that you're aging out of relevance to a patriarchal society, right? You're no longer a breeder, so off to the hinterlands to you. So I think, it's been sort of this great area of disinterest, and it's really fascinating. If you look at medicine historically, they thought, menstrual blood was toxic, it had to come out of your body. And so obviously in menopause, that toxic blood is staying in your body. So it was sort of seen as this sort of inherently toxic state, right? Obviously they had a different view of how the body works. So I think it's really related to just this sort of centuries and centuries of, youth being prized for women and not experience, not the wealth and of everything that you can bring with the history of your whole life. And it's really fascinating when we look at sort of the evolution, sort of why we have menopause. And, one of the main theories is called the grandmother or the wise woman hypothesis. And the idea is it's evolution, the long game. So, the evolution is you got to pass your genetics on to the next generation. Well, how does that happen with menopause? You're not passing your genetics along. Well, what you're doing is you're assisting your next generation so they can have more children, because you know what? Someone helping around the house with childcare, someone helping gathering food, someone helping doing all those things offloads the person to have more children. And so there's a lot of data from HOSDA in Tanzania and also historical birth records. Actually, some of the research is from Canada, some's from Finland, some's from Utah, that actually shows that, when there's a grandmother in the family unit, there are more grandchildren. And when you move away, that impact is lost. And it makes a lot of sense, right? And so, this idea that as we age, we don't have value is actually something that has been, proven wrong, I think, by science. And we need to demand that our culture catches up.
Thank you. Now let's talk about some of the strategies we can implement to help us through these big hormonal shifts. I'll start with Dr. Lem. You work at the intersection of health and our environment. As a long-time advocate for the health benefits of connecting to nature, can you tell us about the effects of our environment on our hormones and our health, particularly the benefits to those experiencing menopause?
I feel kind of funny talking about the benefits of nature and health now, because Dr. Gunter, you kept talking about how nature is run the other way if you hear this word. But run towards nature, please, and I'm going to tell you why. So I direct Canada's National Nature Prescription Initiative called PARX, and we like to say in our program that nature time, and one might argue other things given the composition of this panel, but should be the fourth pillar of health, just as important as healthy diet, healthy sleep, and exercise at maintaining a healthy lifestyle. And this is a body of evidence that is decades deep, and in fact, a body of evidence that I came across myself after I moved from a nature-rich area of the country where my first job was in northern BC, in Hazelton, back to downtown Toronto, essentially where I was born, and was surrounded by skyscrapers and concrete instead of trees and bears. And I found myself much more stressed living in the city, even though the work itself was much less stressful, from being a rural ER doc running an emergency department, delivering babies in the middle of the night, to outpatient student health with specialists on every corner. And so this led me to start learning about the health benefits of nature, because I looked at the research, and in fact, I was astounded by what I found. And so in particular, in menopausal women, they've actually done a lot of research in different subsets of the population, and menopausal women is one of them. And what they found in recent studies, that they found that walking outside on a nature trail, for example, versus walking indoors actually improves your mood significantly more than just being inside and doing that exercise. There's a recent study from China, in fact, that showed that menopausal women who walked on a forest trail, again, compared to doing exercise indoors, had a reduction in their menopausal symptoms, improvement in sleep, and improvement in mood. And there's all kinds of evidence in other kinds of age groups and in men as well that this holds true. And the thinking behind this is there are a number of different mechanisms, but one major mechanism is that when we head out into nature, this reduces our cortisol levels, because nature is where we were meant to be. Like, we evolved in biodiverse environments with food sources, water sources, trees that we could cut down and create shelter from and escape from predators in. So basically wanting to be in these natural environments is an evolutionary benefit. Our brains calm down when we're in places that are good for our health. So that's one theory as to why we're drawn to nature, and why when we go there, our cortisol drops, our stress drops, and that makes our bodies work better and get out of that fight or flight mode. And so when you think about women and girls and the environment, I do want to point out that climate change is actually impairing our ability to connect to these outdoor natural environments. So right here in Vancouver, which most of you are probably from, unless you came out all the way out to see Dr. Gunter and Dr. Brotto, there are still areas of nature access, like ocean access, that are still washed out from the massive flooding that happened just over a year ago. In my own neighborhood, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Locarno Beach before, but the big dock there, it's still splintered, there's still driftwood up there, and it's unusable more than a year later. And so climate change is affecting our ability to connect to nature, but because women tend to be lower income in this country and other places, because women are lucky enough to become pregnant, pregnant women are actually more likely to be affected negatively by smoke, heat, and different factors different negative health factors that come out due to climate change. We are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change, and we also have a lot to gain from connecting to the environments that climate change affects our ability to connect to. So again, I think this is a reason why women in particular should be advocating for healthier environments, whether it's better access to nature, whether it's reducing the amount of fossil fuels we burn and adapting to what climate change is bringing to us, because we're more affected than men, and we have more to gain when we have healthier environments.
Thank you. Dr. Brotto, CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, can help a lot of folks with some menopausal concerns, including anxiety and stress, depressed mood, and hot flashes. Can you speak a bit about the benefits of not only CBT, but other non-medical interventions like mindfulness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. And before I answer it, I want to address something that Dr. Gunter said earlier about the tendency for women to often be dismissed when they, show up with vaginal pain or pain in their chest, and they're often told, it's all in your head, go home and have a glass of wine. Certainly a lot of the women that I see, they might be told, well, maybe you're just not attracted to your partner, and that's why you have painful sex. So when we talk about something as being in your mind, a woman might perceive it as they think I'm making it up, right? Or it's all psychological. In other words, I did something to elicit this health difficulty in me. So that's very different from saying something might be in your brain, and therefore brain methods like cognitive behavioral therapy, like mindfulness-based approaches work. So I just want to point that out at the outset, that just because a psychological treatment works and it works through your brain does not mean that psychological factors caused your issue, or that you inherently did anything to cause the issue. So I'll say that right up front, because I hear that on a regular basis, as women being dismissed, or unfortunately women suffering from pain or a sexual health issue for years and years, seeing 7 different healthcare providers before they're taken seriously. Meanwhile, the symptoms continue, the impact on their quality of life continues. All right, that aside, let's get back to the question, which is, what is the role of these factors? Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a well-established system of psychological therapy that aims to improve your mood by addressing problematic beliefs that we have. So a problematic belief might be, there's nothing I can do to improve my sexual desire. Right? So it's very catastrophic, it's very all or nothing. And having a belief like that can absolutely not only impact your mood in a negative way, leads you to be hopeless, helpless, maybe angry, obviously depressed, but it can lead to behavioral changes that then reinforce the belief to begin with, right? So if you believe there's nothing you can do to improve something, you might give up trying. Right? So it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's how cognitive behavioral therapy works. Mindfulness-based therapy, which the Buddhists have been doing for 4,000 years and living well and living very happily, has been introduced into Western medicine about 40 years ago, thanks to the incredible work of Jon Kabat-Zinn, who actually was not a Buddhist or a meditation practitioner himself, but he was a molecular biologist who attended a talk by a Buddhist monk one day, was absolutely convinced and transformed by the idea that tuning in to our symptoms trumps tuning out. In other words, when we're able to be with and notice and kind of observe even really difficult symptoms like pain, but in an accepting and compassionate way, maybe this is a better alternative than distracting or ruminating over. So when we fast forward now 40 years, there's a ton of scientific evidence. In fact, almost my whole career has been focused on evaluating, compared to control groups and comparison groups, how do these kinds of treatments work to improve things like loss of desire, pain with sex, anorgasmia, sexual changes after cancer, sexual difficulties that might arise secondary to an experience of rape or sexual assault, and many other kinds of sexual difficulties. So the science is pretty compelling. How do they work? Through the brain, right? We're back to the brain. And let's get away from this idea also of what we call Cartesian dualism. The brain lives up here and operates what we think, and then there's the body, which is disconnected and operates, it's our physiology and it's our hormones. No, every thought that we have has a physiological manifestation in the body, and vice versa. And sexual health is sort of the perfect epitome of that. Have you ever started to engage, and finally we're getting to the sex part, so I'm going to take us there because it's almost 8 o'clock at night and we're all waiting for this. So have you ever sort of been, in the throes of a sexual encounter, and it's going well and you're connecting and you're feeling good and you're feeling pleasure, and then you start to have a thought, did I turn the oven off? And then you bring your mind back, and then you said, oh, wait a second, did I? Let me just walk back through it again. And you sort of go back and forth, back and forth and back and forth, lost in the ruminative thoughts. Guess what? Your body will stop responding, right? It's not an automatic reflex that if you just press the button long and hard enough, it'll continue. No, it relies on the messages from the brain to tell the body to continue. And in turn, the brain receives the messages of pleasure and excitement and arousal from the body. So the brain and the body they're part of the same entity. We don't separate them. So all of this provides really good scientific evidence, which again has been tested in many, many controlled studies from around the world, that both cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness-based approaches can be really, really great sources of treatment for addressing sexual health and genital pain.
Thank you. So we have one more question before the audience questions are going to be taken in. So definitely get ready for your questions. But before that, Dr. Gunter, let's talk about menopausal hormone therapy, formerly known as hormone replacement therapy. MHT is often framed as either dangerous or a miracle. What's the reality and some of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to this type of therapy?
Right. Well, so very few things in medicine are, binary. There's very few things there are few therapies that are all amazing or, all bad. And I think that menopausal hormone therapy fits right in with that. It's something that can help a lot of people with some symptoms of menopause. It's not a panacea, and it's not the fountain of youth as it's often advertised. And so what we saw, I think, in response to the Women's Health Initiative and how that was misinterpreted and presented, was we've sort of seen lately sort of this, I would say, overemphasizing menopausal hormone therapy, meaning, the answer to having some information that led you in one direction is not to overcorrect, right? The answer is to be correct, right? That's the answer. And so we unfortunately see people online, many of them doctors, recommending hormones for everything. And then we also unfortunately see people who are not up to date and still telling people that they're dangerous and terrible. And every side effect, every medication has some kind of risk. If you take Tylenol, it has some kind of risk. If you drive your car here, it has some kind of risk. And the problem is that as humans, we have a hard time sometimes assessing risk. And so we hear these messages about something being scary, and we remember that. So I would say, I wrote a whole book on it. So obviously, if I could summarize it in 3 lines, it would never in a book. But I would say that it's something that can help a lot of people with some symptoms. And but I always say that if you could only do one thing in menopause, it would be exercise. And now I'm learning I should do that more outside than inside. But yeah, so exercise touches your brain, your heart, your bones, your sex life, your mood. It touches everything. And so one of the concerns about the overemphasis on hormones is it takes away from these other things that's the foundation of your house, right? So, so I think that hormones absolutely have a place for a lot of people. They can they can solve some problems. They can't solve every problem, but also don't forget your exercise.
I won't, thank you. Well, thank you all for your very thoughtful responses. We're going to get some questions from the audience. We do have 2 mics set up on either side for our in-person questions, but we'll start off with some questions from our online audience. So Dr. Krishana Sankar, can we hear the first online question, please?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for a phenomenal panel. So the first online question, this is open to the panel, but I suppose we can start with Dr. Gunter. So it says, going back to celebrity influence on health, can you comment on Canada's healthcare crisis with access? How much of the misinformation and influence may be due to access and availability versus getting a face-to-face appointment with a doctor, let alone a specialist in the field?
Well, I think lack of access to healthcare plays a huge role. That's one of the gaps, right? So if you have this gap, of course people are going to go elsewhere. And if you have a difficult time accessing healthcare and there's people talking about that symptom or the problem or the concern that you have, and they have a large following, of course that's going to give them more attention. So I would say absolutely the celebrity sort of encroachment into health and wellness is, I think, a direct consequence of gaps. Because if those gaps didn't exist, they wouldn't be able to make that kind of money.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gunter. Dr. Brotto, Dr. Lem?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll address it from the research side of things. And, research is really the track on which healthcare is the train that drives upon. And so, in a perfect system, we would have access to healthcare that is directly informed by science, and we have challenges with both. When we look at our federal healthcare funding for all areas of health, only 7% of the national dollars actually go towards women's health. Yet 50% of the population is probably women, and so they impact a lot of people. So even when people are able to have access to healthcare, we have a real problem in having the science to support effective treatments, do diagnostics, not to mention the fact that even when we are able to fund good science, that good science doesn't necessarily make its way into education, healthcare policy, decision-making, et cetera, et cetera. So we just want to make sure that we look at this from all sides of the coin, that research is really foundational also to good health.
And I'll just add to that by saying there has been systematic underfunding of primary care across Canada, within BC as well. I think statistics just before we're in December said that 1 million people in British Columbia were without a family doctor. And I think this is almost criminal in a way, because we know the research shows that when people have a primary care practitioner, they go to the emergency room less. They have longer life expectancies. They have better overall health and well-being. So the fact that we haven't actually been investing in primary care is having a direct impact on our health. Something else I want to point out, though, as well, is that when we do have access to doctors and nurses and other science-based health professionals, people have a high degree of trust in them, actually. I think in some ways we kind of undersell ourselves. Survey after survey that's done globally actually puts doctors, typically nurses actually ahead of doctors, and scientists, in fact, at the top of the list of professionals who are most trusted by the general public. So I think if we can invest in primary care, we can invest in better connections between patients and evidence-based health professionals, we're going to have a healthier population, because they'll be exposed to the real science and the evidence, and people that they trust.
Thank you all for that. So one more question from our online audience. And so I can see this one probably going to Dr. Brotto. I find it difficult to speak to GPs about sexual health because of the stigma associated with it and slut-shaming culture. This person mentions that they often experience slut shaming themselves. They would like to know, how do we overcome this?
Oh, it breaks my heart when I hear that, and I hear that every day. And I hear it among women across ages. There's a bit of a fallacy that, because we live in a sex-saturated society, that young people have tremendous comfort talking about sex. I can assure you they don't. And that there, unfortunately, are many, many, many instances of unwanted sexual activity that we're also not having adequate conversations about. I think it takes great courage, and I think when we remember that when we really own sexual health as a part of our quality of life and living well, and not seeing it as something frivolous or fringe or something inappropriate. As healthcare providers, we also need to do a lot better around addressing a lot of the stereotypes and myths, such as if you're single, you're not engaging in sex. If you're past a certain age, you're not engaging in sex. If you're of a particular group, and you name the group, you're not engaging in sex. And so I think that we just need to address it head on. And so forums like this one, where we can have conversations and be mostly serious and a little bit funny, because come on, it's sex, we've got to have some humor in there as well, then that's going to go a long way in having those conversations. But it does take bravery. Change is possible. Change is slow, but change is possible.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Pashana. Now on to our in-person audience. If you have any questions, feel free to come towards the mics. They aren't scary, I promise you.
Hello, back to sex. So first wanted to recommend everyone Dr. Broder's latest book, Sex Through Mindfulness, super cool. And yes, young people are uncomfortable talking about sex. I've been hopping myself up for like 40 minutes to ask this question. But here we go. The question is about mindfulness, and I'm a big fan, and I think it works. However, I find it hard converting people into these conversations. Personally, for me, it seems like there are two reasons why. First one being some people think it's some woo-woo thing because it's so recent in the Western culture. And second is that some people think it's inseparable from spirituality in some religious context, which is not true, and it's very well explained in the book. So my question is, what are the tips, and maybe they're age-specific, about, and like from your studies maybe, what arguments or like what are the prediction of retention of women in the mindfulness programs? And like for somebody who have never heard about it, maybe somebody a couple of generations from me, sort of how do you talk about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your kudos, and thank you for your question. Here's how I explain it to people. I pass them a plate. On the plate is a raisin. And I very slowly invite them to pick up the raisin in their hand and observe it. Observe the color, the shape, what happens when the light bounces off the surface. Then I invite them to put it up to their nose and close their eyes and move it nostril to nostril and just tune in to whatever aromas are meeting their nostrils. Then I invite them to put it into their mouth without chewing and just observe the enormous rush and gush of salivation that happens when the raisin is in their mouth. Then I invite them to take one bite and tune in to the sounds, the tastes, the smells, all the feels that happen from that one bite. And then very slowly, after the next 2 minutes, I invite them to swallow, notice the taste, the aftertaste, the echo of the aftertaste, and the echo of the echo's aftertaste. Then I invite them to open their eyes and ask them, what was that like? And they say, oh my gosh, I normally take a handful and pop them in, and I swallow without chewing, and I hate raisins, and I could actually, appreciate that it had contours, and it's not just brown, it's purple and green and brown and all these colors, and I could see the place where the stem was. And they usually go on for a few minutes. And then if I'm talking about sex, I'll say, how is eating the raisin in this way relevant to your sexuality? And they'll say, oh my gosh, if I could even bring a fraction of that attention into my sexual encounter that I did with this raisin, imagine the things that I would notice. Imagine the early signs of arousal that I would be tuning into and kind of build on and stay with, and all the subtle changes that happen in my neck and in my back and in my feet when my toes curl during sexual activity. And then I'll pause and I'll say, and this is how mindfulness works. So the answer to the question is, you don't tell them, you invite them to experience it themselves. And the actual experience of mindfulness is far more powerful than me standing up here citing study after study and showing statistic after statistic. You just experience it.
Wow. Oh, yes.
I had to, a lot of what you said is sort of what I've lived with. I have PCOS, and I'm sure many of you do. And going through the research of how does that apply to menopause and what is the interplay there? And there's all these supplements that they're recommending, and there's not a ton of research out there on it. So I was just wondering, what does PCOS do, or any sort of those kind of hormonal syndromes or whatever they might be? How does that affect menopause, or maybe all of what we talked about tonight?
Mm-hmm. Right. So polycystic ovarian syndrome is a medical condition. It's actually the most common endocrine condition. It affects 10% of women. And it's a very complex condition. And there actually has been a lot of research in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, and understanding all of the complexities is just really complex. But basically the summary is that we have irregular ovulation. There are increased levels of testosterone, increased levels of insulin, and insulin resistance. And those things touch many, many aspects of the body. They touch the liver, they touch the adrenal glands, they touch the ovaries, they touch the brain. And there are many health ramifications that come from it. The genetics for polycystic ovarian syndrome has actually probably been around for 10,000 years. So many of the genes that are there, we don't really quite understand what benefit they may have had. You know, how we might have lived 10,000 years ago is obviously different than how we live today. People who have polycystic ovarian syndrome actually tend to have a bit of a later menopause, a later entering into menopause. And there's some theories behind that that are really theories. Some people, the irregular ovulation with polycystic ovarian syndrome actually tends to improve in the 40s. And so one theory is that allows a group of people to reproduce later, and that might help. These are, again, all theories. We don't really have a good understanding of it. But we also know that it's not just related to the ovaries, because after menopause, many of the endocrine disturbances, the increased testosterone, the insulin resistance actually persist. We actually do have quite a lot of good evidence-based therapies. We could have more, and we certainly don't understand all of the complexities. But the tie-in with menopause is kind of a bit of a later age of menopause, and the misconception people have that because we use the term polycystic ovarian syndrome, but it's much more than the ovaries, so the idea that the health ramifications end with menopause isn't true.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question.
Hello, my question I guess is for Dr. Gunter, but anyone can answer. What advice do you have for people to make the most out of your doctor or your specialist appointment? Because I do write down questions because I don't like to Google things that I find it very stressful. And I work with older adults, and they find the same thing. There's just not enough time with the doctor or a specialist to kind of go through all your concerns or questions.
So I think it's really good to have a list. And because often it's really stressful. You think you know what's wrong with you, and or what's wrong, but you know what you want to talk about, and you get there, and then all of a sudden the time crunch and everything, and then things kind of go out of your head. So have a list of the things that are bothering you, the things that you would like to fix, and you can show the list to the provider. You can walk through the list. I think it's good for people to actually see everything on the list, because what doesn't bother you so much might actually bother me a lot, right? So if somebody's 56 and having some vaginal bleeding, you might say, oh, well, it's not that much bleeding, it doesn't bother me. I really care because that's a sign of cancer. So, you want your doctor to see the list so they can make sure there aren't red flags that they need to move to the top. And then understand that you might only be able in a shorter time limit to get through 2 or 3 of those things on the list, and then to try to ask for some type of follow-up to kind of work on the others. So I think that sort of starting from the top and working down is probably the best way to make use of a shorter time. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have that. We would have more time to sort of listen to the whole story and put everything together. And I think there's obviously there are some family doctors and specialists that are able to do that. And so that would be my advice. My other advice is Googling can be very stressful, and some people can do it very well, and some people can't. And I think it's great to know your limits. But to think about where you might be able to get quality health information on the subject so you're able to go in more informed to have the discussion. So for example, if your question is about vaginal discharge, you might be able to get information from the CDC on that, right? Or from Health Canada to have more of a basic understanding. So when you go in to have that discussion, you're a little bit more on the same level.
Thank you.
Any other input from?
Sure. I mean, I can add input from the perspective of a family doctor who often people come with, again, the undifferentiated issues. So I totally agree with Dr. Gunter. Lists are useful. And sometimes the interesting thing is, like you said, what's high priority on your list might not be what's high priority on my list. So understanding that we probably in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, if you're lucky, that we can't address everything, and being willing to follow up. And then also knowing the rest of your history, because sometimes I'll have a patient come in and they have these concerns, and then I'll ask, well, what's your family history? What conditions run in your family? What medications are you taking? When's the last time you had this kind of test? And they won't be able to tell me because they've gone through a lot of tests or something, and so they just don't have that information at the tip of their fingers. So be prepared with the other aspects of your health history too, so that you can make the most of that visit in the short time that you have.
In terms of like the Women's Health Initiative being bailed on and not being completed, because I read that long article in the New York Times about how this study about estrogen wasn't completed or finished, so the data was also not done. And we're talking about the gap that we're all enduring at this moment. Is there things that we can do as human citizens to encourage political people or people out there to start a new study estrogen more and pick those things up again?
So I think one of the problems with, for example, that article in the New York Times is there's tons of other studies. The Women's Health Initiative isn't the only one. And so I think that's a really important thing to know about, that we do actually have quite a lot of data from other studies. There'll never be another study like the Women's Health Initiative. It was the largest randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled trial. There's over 27,000 women randomized to either estrogen in one of 2 arms or placebo. And at 40 academic centers. It was a monumental effort to get that going. And the idea that we could see that again, I mean, I would love to, but the effort and the money and the time to do that is really challenging. So, the Women's Health Initiative was halted at 5 years for the estrogen plus progestin arm and 7 years for the estrogen only arm. But actually many women in those studies have actually been continued to be followed long term. So we actually have some really long-term follow-up data from them. But we also have lots of studies from other countries, also other studies still from the US that have been both randomized trials, but also really good observational studies from large databases. Now there's issues with observational studies, but the thing that most of these studies tell us is they actually all tell us pretty much the same thing. So that's a really good piece of, if every study tells us that estrogen helps hot flashes, and of course every single estrogen product that's on the market had to have been studied against placebo, right? So we actually have all of those clinical trial data to look at as well. So we actually have a fair bit of data. There's also osteoporosis trials and other types of things. And so there are still unanswered questions. And one of the things about science is the more studies you do, the more questions you realize that you have, because you can't possibly study every single question that you have. You have to kind of have some kind of limit, otherwise your study coordinators will not be able to, you won't be able to get people to be in the studies, right? You can only draw so much blood, you can only do so many things, right? So there are some kind of limits to that, and people only want to come for so many follow-up visits. So we absolutely do need to have more data about more things that we don't have good data on, but we actually do know a lot, and I think that's really important. And I think one of the disservices, as I mentioned about that article, was I think it led people to believe that that really was the only study and there hasn't been any other kind of work, and that's simply just not true. But we do need to know more about long-term cognitive impacts of transdermal versus oral. We need to know more about what happens when people continue to take hormones beyond the age of 65. We don't have good data with that. And so how can we get better data? Well, and this doesn't just apply to menopause, this applies to everything that we've been talking about. We have to demand of our politicians that they're funding healthcare in the appropriate way from the research, the idea that 7% of research dollars are going to women's health. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that lots of things get thrown into the women's health bucket that aren't, like women's heart health. Well, wait a minute, otherwise heart health is men's heart health? It's all of these things kind of get parceled in. And so to demand of our politicians, to demand better access to care, better information. I mean, something that I've often wondered in a country where, we have universal health care, why is there no national educational menopause curriculum, right? Why should people, because it's not taught in school. I mean, obviously it should be, but also honestly, if you learned it when you were 14, you might not remember it when you're 50. I'm just saying, right? So, but the idea, shouldn't everybody who's 14 know about the grandmother hypothesis? Wouldn't that change how you maybe think about, about aging? But why don't we have a national curriculum? So whether you live in Flin Flon, Manitoba, or at the corner of Bay and Bloor, you can go online in whatever language is right for you and learn about the physiology, learn about the options. Why isn't vaginal estrogen over the counter? Should be. It's safer than a lot of other drugs that are over the counter. The politicians are the people who have answers to these questions. So I would say, we need to demand more of politicians. We need to have more women in politics, and we have to make some noise because that's how things happen.
I want to get a bit more specific about what you're saying about advocating to politicians, because I do a ton of advocacy work around climate change and nature. And so it can seem like a really big issue. It's like, well, how do we get women's health funded nationally, right? It's like, where do you start? And I think it starts with having conversations. So trying to break down these taboos, speaking with your friends, speaking with your neighbors, speaking with your partner about this, and raising awareness about the issue so that it becomes more normalized. And then I think it's really important to choose a target. So what are you passionate about? What skills do you have to bring this target and your goal in front of decision makers? Building a team too, like whether it's your neighbors, your friends, your family, or whatever, coming up with the idea for a petition and then starting to work on it. I mean, we can complain and complain and complain about things, but unless we actually start to put our effort into it, nothing's going to happen. And then I think not being afraid of decision makers, because we have to remember government is here to work. Well, they're supposed to be here to work for us, right? Like, we elect them, they represent us in each of our ridings. You should be able to approach your local politician and say, this is an issue that's important to me, and here's the team behind me who's advocating for this. Why don't you put a petition forward in the House of Commons about this? There are lots of different ways that you can advocate directly to decision makers. And I would say a good place to start is, in fact, with your own local MLA, with your own local MP, and show them that you have a bit of a team behind you, and it just continues from there.
We have a perfect example of that, and that was last week's announcement in British Columbia of the approval of contraception free of charge for every British Columbian. And yes. Now, what a lot of people don't know is actually the data that supported that decision were completely done and dusted about 5 years ago. So the data were sitting there, and it was literally 5 years of advocacy by the research team and doing the very things that we're hearing about, talking to the MLAs, the MPs, going to higher and higher levels, being a broken record, saying the same thing, and finally it made a difference. So I love that example because I know in speaking with the research team, they never thought that that day would come, that all the thousands of hours of science evaluating, the safety, the economic impact, what are the harms, what are the myths, et cetera. And then when it was announced last week, it was first of all, it was a victory for women's health. And it was also a wonderful example of what happens when we use the power of our voice to people who can make decisions. And so take that with you. Take that with you. Go home, call your MP, call your MLA, and demand better. Demand that we have more dedicated funding going to women's health topics so that women don't have to suffer in silence.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for your fantastic questions in person and online. And thank you to our expert panel for your wonderful answers to them. Do we have time for our last panel question or not? 1 minute answers, okay.
Okay.
And I've got the clock there, so I am keeping my eye out. Okay, so I do want to ask you all, so throughout the pandemic, we have seen a glut of misinformation. The same is true when it comes to women's health. Do you have any words of wisdom when it comes to navigating misinformation about our health? Dr. Gunter, you can start, and then we can work our way down.
Oh, wow, a 1 minute answer. I would say be mindful of the information that you come across online, and don't be afraid to pause and fact check and step back and figure out, what the motive is, and go back to the idea about you want to pre-bunk. You don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to undo misinformation.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground tonight, so I'm sure the answers are wrapped up in there. But I would just implore all of you in the audience, take one thing you learned tonight and share it verbatim with someone that you care about and know, and then there will be a nice ripple effect of information sharing. And too often, information as a scientist, I know all too well that information stays buried in medical journals and never gets translated or shared with the public in a way that can improve how they live. So when you hear accurate, good information that has landed with you in a certain way, share that with someone that you care about.
My small piece of advice is look beyond this box. Look to the wider environment for causes of what the symptoms you are might be. Look to the air pollution. Look to what's inside your home. Don't blame everything on hormones, because there's so much profit to be made in selling supplements to people to alter or balance their hormones, but in many cases, it's not the hormones that are the problem. So just be open to other ideas.
Wonderful, and I think you guys accomplished the timing. Brilliant. Well, thank you, Dr. Gunter, Dr. Brotto, and Dr. Lem for your time and your insights on this panel. Personally, as a woman with many hormones, I definitely found this conversation very insightful and empowering. I will now pass it back to our Science Up First director, Magda Beimer, to deliver the closing remarks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Esther. Okay, so I'm still processing. That was an amazing conversation. Bags and bags of information going home with each and every one of us. Thank you. Thank you so much, Esther, for your incredible moderating and for leading us through the discussion. And can I get a really massive round of applause for our expert panel today? And of course, a big thank you to you, our audience, both here in person and at home. It means so much to us for having you here with us this evening. We hope that you leave with a bit better understanding of hormones and women's health, and with the information that you need to make all those really important decisions about your health. The conversation isn't over. This is really just the beginning. We hope that you follow at Science Up First on all of our social channels, and visit our website, scienceupfirst.com, for additional information. We have had so many questions online, and I'm sure you have many of them as well. We will be hosting additional opportunities for questions and answers with experts. So keep an eye on our channels, and if you do have a burning question that hasn't been answered, feel free to submit it into our DMs. We'll be very happy to find the right expert to answer that for you. At Science at First, we are committed to sharing the best available science in creative ways to stop the spread of misinformation. We hope that you'll look to us for clarity to help you collect that right information when you're making your decisions. And of course, on behalf of the Canadian Association of Science Centres, I want to thank you for spending International Women's Day with us. We'd like to invite our in-person guests to the dessert reception in the lobby, where Dr. Gunter will be signing some of her books as well. And thank you again to everyone. Have a wonderful evening.